the Japanese had already launched a 6-5 aircraft strike against the American task force. Through a ring of anti-aircraft fire and the carrier's fighter cover, the Japanese dive and torpedo bombers registered a number of hits on the Hornet. By 9:30 am the carrier was dead in the water, but planes from the Hornet had also located the Japanese and 6 bombs struck the deck of Peshkaku, removing her from the battle. Some Hornet SBs attacked the heavy cruiser Chikuma, damaging her so severely that she was forced to return to the port at Truk. The Battle of Santa Cruz was the 4th carrier clash of the war. 48. The Japanese managed to sink the carrier Hornet, damaged the Enterprise, a battleship, a cruiser, and a destroyer. Yamamoto ordered his subordinates to seek a night battle to finish off the fleeing Americans, but their fuel situation forced them to return to Truk by the 30th of October. Although American losses had been high, the Japanese had been turned back. 48. 2 Japanese carriers were heavily damaged and carrier air groups had also been decimated, with greatest single loss of carrier air crews to date, 148 aviators. 49. These losses prevented the Japanese from exploiting their success. 48. Failure to take Guadalcanal. The wreck of one of the 4 Japanese transports Kinugawa Maru beached and destroyed at Guadalcanal on the 15th of November 1942, photographed 1 year later. The battle for Guadalcanal reached a crescendo in November. After victory at Santa Cruz, the Japanese were sure that the naval balance in the South Pacific had swung in their favor. 50. They planned a more substantial effort to reinforce the island. A similar plan to the one conducted in October was put forward, with a larger convoy preceded by another bombardment by battleships to neutralize the airfield. The Japanese were prepared to employ sufficient forces to guarantee its success. On the night of November 12-13, a force of 2 battleships, Haya and Kirishima, 1 light cruiser and 11 destroyers departed for Guadalcanal to bombard the airfield. However, this attempt was thwarted by a smaller American force of 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers, which intercepted the Japanese force, and a vicious night action ensued at close range. 50. Losses were heavy on both sides, but the critical bombardment of airfield never occurred. 50. Haya was damaged and the following day was sunk by American aircraft, becoming the first Japanese battleship to be lost in the war. 50. The Japanese then attempted another bombardment with a force centering on the battleship Kirishima, with support from 2 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyer squadrons. The Japanese had additional battleships that were available, but were not employed. 50. On the night of the 14th of November, 2015, this attempt was again met by the American force, which included 2 battleships Washington and South Dakota. In another vicious night battle, the Japanese were again turned back, losing the battleship Kirishima during the first battleship duel of the Pacific War. 50. These 2 battles, which were fought at night, becoming known as the First and Second Naval Battles of Guadalcanal, were the decisive events of the campaign. 50. While the American Shag delivered large numbers of additional troops to Guadalcanal, the Japanese only delivered 2,000 troops armed an insignificant amount of supplies. 50. Additionally, the large Japanese convoy had lost all 10 transports, which had been sunk by American aircraft from the undamaged airfield. 50. Naval losses were heavy for both sides. The Americans lost 2 cruisers and 7 destroyers, and many ships had been severely damaged. The Japanese lost 2 battleships, a heavy cruiser, and 3 destroyers. The Japanese had been defeated more by a failure to mass their forces rather than by being outfought. 50. The attrition suffered by the Japanese during the battles for Guadalcanal was too great. On January the 4th, the Navy section of the Imperial General Headquarters instructed Yamamoto to prepare the withdrawal of the remaining troops from Guadalcanal of the
Yes, did it again. We have to read from the top every time I do this.
Transports, which had been sunk by American aircraft from the undamaged airfield. 50 naval losses were heavy for both sides. The Americans lost 2 cruisers and 7 destroyers, and many ships had been severely damaged. The Japanese lost 2 battleships, a heavy cruiser, and 3 destroyers. The Japanese had been defeated more by a failure to mass their forces rather than by being outfought. 50 The attrition suffered by the Japanese during the battles for Guadalcanal was too great. On January the 4th, the Navy section of the Imperial General Headquarters instructed Yamamoto to prepare the withdrawal of the remaining troops from Guadalcanal. 50 The evacuation of Guadalcanal was codenamed Operation KE. 50 The Americans detected the preparations for the operation and believed they were actually for another Japanese attempt to reinforce the island. The evacuation was carefully planned to take place in 3 destroyer lifts and would begin in late January 1943. 50 The first operation was conducted with 20 destroyers on February 1, another with 20 destroyers was conducted on February the 4th. A third and final operation was conducted with 18 destroyers on February 7. 51 Operation KE was successful and 10,652 men were evacuated from Guadalcanal, with Japanese losses only being a single destroyer. 51 Central Solomons and New Guinea. With Guadalcanal lost, the Japanese focus shifted to the Central Solomons and New Guinea. However, during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea on March 2, an Allied air attack destroyed a convoy attempting to move troops from Rabaul to Lee on New Guinea. 51 To rectify Japan's declining position, Yamamoto devised a major air offensive to counter the growing Allied strength in the Solomons. He moved the air groups of the combined fleet's 4 carriers of about 160 aircraft to Rabaul to join the 190 aircraft of the 11th Air Fleet. This brought the Japanese air strength there to some 350 aircraft. The air offensive was codenamed Operation Igo, consisting of 4 major attacks conducted on Allied positions on Guadalcanal, Buna, Port Moresby and Milne Bay on the 7th of April, 2011, 12 and 14, respectively. 52 In mid-April, the Japanese concluded the operation, claiming success against Allied shipping and defending fighters. In fact, little had been achieved and Japanese losses were heavier than those suffered by the Allies. 52 Resulting in further attrition to the vital Japanese carrier air crews. 52 During 1943, the IJN attempted to preserve its strength in the face of 2 attack routes by the Americans. In the Solomons, the action turned to the Central and Northern Solomons between March and November. During this period, the Japanese and Americans fought 7 surface engagements. All of these actions were fought at night, during which the Japanese still enjoyed an advantage. Twice, Japanese destroyers defeated an Allied force composed of cruisers and destroyer, demonstrating to the Americans Japanese prowess at night fighting. 52 In early August, at Vela Gulf, 3 out of 4 Japanese destroyers were sunk by American destroyers using radar with a new doctrine which emphasized torpedo attacks. 53 It was the first time in the war that Japanese destroyers had been beaten during a night battle. 53 The next action, fought on August 18, was indecisive. On October the 6th, the 2 sides met again. Japanese torpedoes shattered the American formation, but the Japanese did not follow up their advantage, with 1 destroyer sunk from each side. 53 On November the 2nd, the Japanese committed 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 6 destroyers to attack the American beachhead on Bougainville Island. In another night action, this time at Empress Augusta Bay, an American force of 4 light cruisers and 8 destroyers intercepted the Japanese and defeated them, sinking a light cruiser and a destroyer. Americans suffered no losses, with a single destroyer damaged. The Japanese had lost their tactical advantage in night engagements. 53. Adding to their predicament was the increasing Allied strength in the region, demonstrated when the Second Fleet arrived at Rabaul on November 5 with 6 heavy cruisers to engage American naval forces off Bougainville. They were immediately subjected to an attack by carrier aircraft. 4 of the cruisers were damaged and forced to return to Japan for repairs, and the operation ended as a complete fiasco. 53. This marked the end of Major transports, which had been sunk by American aircraft from the undamaged airfield. 50. Naval losses were heavy for both sides. The Americans lost 2 cruisers and 7 destroyers, and many ships had been severely damaged. The Japanese lost 2 battleships, a heavy cruiser, and 3 destroyers. The Japanese had been defeated more. IJN operations in the South Pacific and the end of Rabaul as a major base. The conclusion that the IJN had lost its edge in night combat was confirmed later in November at Cape St. George, when a force of American destroyers intercepted 5 Japanese destroyers, sinking 3 of them at no loss. 53. Collapse of the defensive perimeter, 1943-44. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had been killed on the 18th of April, 1943. The following day, Admiral Mainichi Koga succeeded Yamamoto as Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet. 54. In May 1943, the Japanese prepared the Operation Z, or the Z Plan, which envisioned the use of the IJN to counter American forces threatening the Japanese outer defense perimeter line. This line extended from the Aleutians down through Wake, the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, Nauru, the Bismarck Archipelago, New Guinea, then westward past Java and Sumatra to Burma. 54. In 1943-44, Allied forces in the Solomons began driving relentlessly to Rabaul, eventually encircling and neutralizing the stronghold. With their position in the Solomons disintegrating, the Japanese modified the Z Plan by eliminating the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, and the Bismarcks as vital areas to be defended. They then based their possible actions on the defense of an inner perimeter, which included the Marianas, Palau, Western New Guinea, and the Dutch East Indies. Meanwhile, in the Central Pacific, a major American offensive was initiated, beginning in November 1943 with landings in the Gilbert Islands. 53. The Japanese were forced to watch helplessly as their garrisons in Gilbert's and then the Marshalls were crushed. 53. The Japanese strategy of holding overextended island garrisons was fully exposed. 55. In February 1944, the U.S. Navy's Fast Carrier Task Force attacked the major Japanese naval base of Truk during Operation Hailstone. Although the combined fleet had moved its major vessels out in time to avoid being caught at anchor in the atoll, 2 days of air attacks resulted in significant losses to Japanese aircraft and merchant shipping. The power of the American attack on Truk far surpassed that of the Japanese attack against Pearl Harbor. 55. The IJN was forced to abandon Truk and were now unable to stop the Americans on any front. Consequently, the Japanese retained their remaining strength in preparation for what they hoped would be a decisive battle. 55. Though the Japanese had been leaders in carrier development, at the beginning of the war many of the IJN's top commanders were still battleship or big gun adherents. 56. However, By early 1944, vice commanders had finally accepted the fact that the carrier was the new capital ship. This realization brought with it a change in fleet organization. On the 1st of March, 1944, the first mobile fleet was created under the command of Vice Admiral Jizapuro Ozawa. Instead of remaining in separate fleets, most of the frontline battleships, cruisers, and destroyers joined the carriers in the mobile fleet. The Japanese finally accepted the concept of entrusting the tactical command of a task force to a carrier admiral.